Today on the Mr. Maple podcast, Matt and Tim check off those boxes on their spring gardener's checklist for Japanese maples.
Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt. Today we have a good one for you. I think you're gonna, benefit from this one. We have the spring gardener's checklist for Japanese maples. So we're basically going to get into it and give you all the best tips and the things you should be looking to do in the early spring.
Hey guys, I'm Tim. Make sure you find us on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to us, and give us a 5-star review. That helps more people find us. We'd really appreciate it. And if you love Japanese maples and you love gardening, make sure you're subscribed to us on YouTube as well. We put out daily videos. And make sure you shop on MrMaple.com. We add at least 10 new trees every single Tuesday at 10 a.m. We're constantly adding new plants year-round to us, to our website here at Mr. Maple. Make sure you're subscribed.
Guys, we do a ton on YouTube. We actually put out 7 days a week content there. And these podcasts, more people are actually listening to our podcast now than catch the YouTube channel, which is pretty crazy. I'm really excited to see that catching on. But if you want to catch the video format of these, the video formats air every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And there's a great live chat going on there where you can get involved in the discussion with a lot of other gardeners from all around the world. And it's a madhouse in there. I love those guys. You make it a lot of fun. And so check out that premiere at 8 p.m. Eastern if you want to get involved and talk to a little bit of the Mr. Maple community there. So we're getting into it today. We've got the spring checklist. Basically, we're going to go over things that you should be looking forward to doing in the spring. We like to do pertinent content, so we like to do content that is, it's going to time frame, it's going to fit for what we're doing right now as gardeners. So these are some steps you should be looking forward to or doing in the early spring.
Now, a lot of these things we're going to be talking about has to do about when plants leaf out. Spring itself is a set date. It starts on Monday, March 20th of this year.
So the trees will be perfectly in leaf at that point. That's it. If your trees aren't in leaf on that date, they must be dead.
So when do maples leaf out, Matt?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. And, we're here in Western North Carolina. We're in zone 6B. We can range a great bit each spring. So some years our springs, I've had spring start the first week in March, and our trees are in leaf, and we stay beautiful and sunny and warm, and there's no changes, and everything's just beautiful all the way through spring, and our spring starts really early. I've had seasons where we weren't even in leaf until second week in April. So there can be a wide window in our area because we have such fluctuating weather here in the mountains. But basically, it depends a good bit on your area. Now, Japanese maples work zones 5 through 9, as we always tell people, and the zones really are based on how cold it gets. So they can grow in a litany of places across the United States. Certainly someone like Dr. Creech we talked to and Stephen F. Austin, his trees in that warm Nacogdoches, Texas are going to be leafing out a full month earlier than us here in Western North Carolina. And as an anecdote, often when I'm going to New Jersey to like Ed Shin's garden, that garden may not even be leafed out until May.
Yeah, that's so true. And then there are different cultivars that leaf out earlier or leaf out later than others. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to think about some of the plants that leaf out first, the Winayama, Katsura, and your Kiyohime, Murasaki Kiyohime types, those are some of the first harbingers of spring. They leaf out as some of the very first trees in the garden almost every single year, where certain selections like Tamukiyama and Emperor One may often leaf out a week or two later than many of the other similar selections. And so whenever it comes to that, there could be a 3 to 4 week window difference between something like a Winayama, a Katsura, and a Tamukiyama.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite trees for Western North Carolina are the ones that leaf out really late, like Emperor One, because it sometimes, we may have Katsura leaf out, almost a month ahead of time. It's funny, some trees are so late to leaf. The Acer penophyllum, I've given up on it sometimes. Like we grow Acer penophyllum here, and it's almost a tropical maple, and I've had it not leaf out until like June, and then like they're almost on the burn pile, and then they start leafing out, and we're like, oh my gosh, those are still in leaf. So there can be a long time frame, specific to each cultivar as to their leaf time. But what you don't want to do is give them a false spring. So I see a lot of people in the winter, and this is really more for the winter checklist, but you don't want to be putting your trees under grow lamps or heat lamps or bringing them inside, putting them in a windowsill and giving them a false spring. Because when that true spring comes, they're going to not be ready for that. They're not going to be adapted to a true spring condition. And letting your trees leaf out at a more moderate pace or just naturally completely outside, it's going to be much more beneficial to you than leafing them out artificially, especially under a grow lamp. Grow lamps are almost impossible to get right.
Now, this podcast is mainly about Japanese maples, but some of the plants that we carry at Mr. Maple that leaf out the latest are the ginkgos and the fagus.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And every year people say, my maples have leafed out.
Right. But my fagus is dead.
My fagus is dead.
Right.
And, the fagus is still leafing out. It's just a much later plant to leaf out. So I wanted to mention that while we were in here.
Ginkgos can be like 3 to 4 weeks. I mean, sometimes we're into, I remember we used to do garden shows. We would be taking maples that have been in leaf for 4 weeks, and some of our ginkgos were just starting in late April to leaf out. And so it would surprise people because people say, well, I know this ginkgo I got in December is dead because all my maples have leafed out. And not necessarily true. So one thing I will throw out here, too, to check your plants, you can give them a scratch test. So if you do have plants that you haven't broke dormancy and you're worried about it, one of the best things you can do is lightly scratch with your thumbnail. Now, if you have healthy buds, you're ahead of the game. Like, things are going to do well. If you have healthy buds, there's buds formation on there and they look good, that's a great thing to be accessing, and they're looking, on the right time frame. But you can give a light scratch with your thumbnail at the top of the tree. You want to do it on the outermost parts, and you're basically looking for green cambium. So if you have green cambium, hey, things are good. Don't worry. Your tree's just leafing out a little bit later. But if you scratch and you're getting a dry, kind of a grayish look to it, it may not have made it. So that's something to look for in that early springtime. I scratch on the outer part so you're not scratching at the base right away, so you're not damaging a tree further down. You want to start at the very ends and work your way down.
Now, whenever we have plants that leaf out, especially plants that leaf out early, if we've got a fluctuation in weather, sometimes we may have something called a cold snap. And what we define as a cold snap is you have an unusually seasoned, warm season right then, and then you have cold weather that comes in that is drastically different. Say you've got 72 degrees, 65 degrees, and then you've got a period of 17 degrees for 3 or 4 days. Mm-hmm. And that is what we consider a cold snap. Now, if plants are leafed out, this is extremely important time to protect your plants.
Right. I have people, it's almost like they're asking you to tell them not to prepare to take care of them. So a lot of times customers, and really wise gardening customers, will say, hey, I know this is happening. I really don't need to do anything, do I? And they're quite shocked because my answer is always, if you're saying that, you probably do need to do something. So people are often asking, like, I don't really need to do this, do I? Like, an ounce of prevention is always worth a pound of cure, my dad always says. And if it's going to be a frost or some of these late cold snaps, it's always better to protect. You're going to ensure that you have a better spring, and you're going to enjoy it more for several months if you're not, getting bit back a little bit by some of these colder temperatures. Now, in Western North Carolina, we can get some crazy weather. It's not uncommon for us to have a few days in late February that are almost 70, and things can start waking up a little bit here. Not too much, just a little bit of white rooting and starting to get more active. We actually keep everything dormant as much as possible here at our nursery. So even though our trees are grown in cold frames, we actually keep the doors open, and we do everything we can to keep that dormancy as late into the season as possible. That just makes it easier to ship our spring orders too.
One of the questions I always get with cold snaps is, when do I need to protect my Japanese maple in a cold snap? Is it only when it's leafed out? Well, that's not always the case. If you have an extreme weather pattern where you're getting basically a polar vortex type situation where you've got extreme differences, if that plant, the buds have already started to swell, that plant is already starting to get active. And during those cases, that's when you need to really protect your Japanese maple, is if that plant is actively trying to grow, if the buds are swelling, that's the time when you probably should protect during a cold snap. Now, the one thing you got to watch out for with cold snaps is doing things that may cause more damage. Often with these cold snaps may come snow. And if you're covering your plants with different things, you may increase that snow load on your plant and cause damage to your plant. So you always have to keep that in mind as well. But cold snaps are a thing that can definitely happen, and they can affect all plants. But with Japanese maples, if they've begun to break bud, they definitely need to be protected. I mean,
yeah, sometimes we're our own worst enemies there, so be careful. Like, I've seen people put like a big pot over, say, like a small tree, and then put like a grow light or a lamp in there. And even sometimes a light bulb can get too hot if it's emitting heat in there and kind of stress a tree out. You don't want them to be going through extreme changes. You want to basically just lighten the load of that cold snap on the tree.
now, protecting plants when the buds are just beginning to swell, that's really mainly a thing in those colder regions when you can get those extreme colds from the cold snaps, like polar vortexes that people have definitely got up north. That is going to be more of the situation there. A lot of the times when we have the cold snaps in the south, it's very different. I mean, this is something where you're just going to need to not worry about it until the plant has actually started to break bud. And by breaking bud, we're talking about the leaf has actually came out of the bud.
Right.
And that's when plants are more important to protect down here in the south.
Yeah, the cold snaps, they're prepared for a little bit of that, especially Japanese maples. They're very adaptable. We're here in western North Carolina, and I find that a lot of the trees can handle more than we think. But an ounce of prevention is always better. So, doing things that are not going to leaf the tree out further are critical. So you don't want to be putting things on there that can make adaptive heat, like plastics. Plastics are something often people will use to cover their plant during a cold snap, and black plastic can heat up a good bit even in the winter months with just a little bit of sunlight. And so the danger with especially clear plastics are you can magnify that sunlight and force the tree more into leaf, causing more cold damage from that cold snap.
And we see that happen so frequently because what people have around in their garden are tarps. They've got trash bags, and they often want to use this plastic material, but it can be very detrimental in trying to protect your plant from a cold snap. They don't really hold in heat, and it actually can trap the moisture and cause more issues on the plant, especially during those cold snap and frost situations.
I think a good rule of thumb is breathable material. Like even if you're not investing in like true frost cloth, like sheets, blankets, burlap, things that have a little bit more breathability to them, they're not going to suffocate your plant. They're not going to hold moisture to the extreme next to your plant. So you want to use more breathable fabrics when protecting. And you want to remember to take that off pretty quickly. The breathable fabrics can themselves kill a plant pretty easily. So you don't want to leave things on very long. And once that cold snap's gone, you want to water those trees to pick them back up. And you want to get all that preventative stuff you've done away from the plant. Now, cold snap's a little bit different than a frost. So there's two different things going on there. Frost are something that, we're getting that cool day. We can get frost here up until April. And often frosts don't kill a Japanese maple, but they certainly can create a little bit more leaf burn.
Yeah, and a frost is simply when you get down to around 32. Frost can actually happen under 38 if there's the right humidity change, which sounds crazy to me because, I typically think of frost happening at 32 degrees when the ice can freeze. But you got to always start watching out for it. And fresh new growth is typically something that has a little bit of antifreeze to it. The biggest problem with the frost we have is when they come later in the season once that leaf has hardened and matured. And this happens in the landscape very frequently here in western North Carolina. It's not uncommon for us to get 1 or 2 late frosts later in the spring.
We pretty much have some frost every year. And most of it, people come here at Memorial Day and it's not even noticeable because we've already flushed that growth out. And most of our frost damage is unnoticeable 1 to 2 weeks into leafing out because the tree's already replenished, it's flushed new growth. And so it's not uncommon, especially where we're at, which is a great place to be growing Japanese maples, to have a little bit of frost damage each year, just a little bit, but not something that's sustainable into the season. Now, so a little bit of that's okay, but you want to be as preemptive and taking care of that as possible. Fabric is your best friend there. There's frost cloth, there's bed sheets. Fitted bed sheets tend to work great because you kind of can already fit them around larger plants. Some plants you can't cover. You've got a 30-foot tree in your garden. You're probably not covering that one up. It's going to be at its own devices there. But smaller plants, go ahead and take that ounce prevention and go ahead and get some bed sheets around them. I like to tape them off to themselves as tightly as I can, but not tape to the bark of the tree. That way they're not blowing away, but you've kind of sustained them there a little bit.
I think that's one of the biggest problems people have with frost is because often during the same times we have frost, we've got this drastic change in weather. Right. And with that drastic change in weather often comes wind that's pushing the weather patterns that are changing that weather to that colder temperature where the frost happens. And sometimes that wind can be a good friend.
Oh, yeah.
But the worst thing that can happen is you have a lot of wind in the morning right before daylight, and then the frost happens and it's dead. I mean, those are the worst frost situations that you can get. But frost, it's really about that ounce of prevention. If you have your trees in containers, bring them in for the garage for the night. If you can, if they're already starting to leaf. Often your trees in containers are going to be the very first trees to put leaves out, and that's just the nature of growing a tree in a container. Those roots heat up faster than ones that are in the ground. So often those are going to be ones you'll want to bring in to your garage for the night. Once that frost threat is passed, put them back outside. Don't leave them inside. One of the biggest problems we have in the spring is, say, a plant has leafed out early and someone has brought it inside to take care of it. Well, at that point, you need to make sure that it doesn't get hit with frost, because those buds are going to start, those leaves are going to start maturing, and they're not going to have that type of antifreeze that Matt and I talked about when they first are beginning to leaf out that a leaf may actually have. They're going to be more mature, and then if you put that outside and it gets frosted, it may get more damage than many of your other plants that you've had outside that are just maturing naturally outside. So keep that in mind.
Now, if you've already gotten hit with a frost or you had a very mild frost, a light liquid fertilizer is great to give them a pickup. You want to be watering right after your frost or heavy cold snaps once you're back above freezing anyway. That's going to give your tree, recovery time. It's going to help. That water's going to help, basically rebuild those cell walls that might have been damaged during that colder snap. And it's going to give that tree what it needs to replenish itself from those damages. So water well right after it gets above freezing. And like Tim was saying, sometimes a little bit of wind's great. It kind of breaks up some of that moisture. So if you have a windy cold snap, frost typically isn't an issue there, because it does tend to break it up. It's just when that lays flat right at that sunbreak when it's hard. Most of your damage occurs right at sunbreak with the frost. And one thing I'd like to get in here, and it's a controversial one. I know this one will be controversial. I don't recommend the home gardener using water here at this stage. If you're having frost damage or frost threats, you'll see those big commercial nurseries with everything outdoors. A lot of times they're in like Georgia or Alabama, and they have these big commercial outdoor nurseries. They have these massive sprinkler systems, and they'll turn them on to kind of prevent against frost. I don't recommend that for the home gardener. One, you don't have that same level of pressure, so you're not getting the same screen level going on there. But often introducing that level of moisture at that colder point in the day is going to cause more damage. You're going to get more moisture and more freeze on your leaf by adding water to the equation.
And I've seen this often done with apple growers in our area, where they'll do this to protect the blooms on the apple trees. But with Japanese maples, I'm not so sure that doesn't even cause damage on maples. I mean, maples leaves are a little more tender, and that ice on the leaves, every time I've done it or accidentally did it here at the nursery, it's caused a lot of damage on the foliage. So keep that in mind, that often when you're going out there and you're watering with a wand, or a sprinkler, trying to put constant water on that, yes, it makes logic a little bit sense. You think, hey, this water's below freezing, I'm putting this in here. But when you don't have enough water to actually cover the plants, it's going to do more harm than good. Because what's going to happen is as you leave, the behind you is freezing.
Right. As gardeners, we really, commercial landscape and commercial nurseries may have the equipment for that. But the honest answer is, as home gardeners, we don't really have the equipment to pull that off. You're just going to be adding water to the situation, creating a lower freeze point for some of those plants. And I don't think it's going to be beneficial to you at all. So I advise heavily against that. I've seen more often than not that go south rather than be a benefit for people.
You can often create more damage doing that than you would actually cause a benefit. And I've seen that happen time and time again. Someone says, I went out there, turned the sprinklers on in my yard, and the side I turned the sprinklers on is completely decimated.
Right.
And the side that I didn't turn the sprinklers on is untouched. So keep that in mind. Often you may be adding that humidity that wasn't there to create the frost in the first place.
In a perfect world, a little bit of frost cloth is going to be your best friend for that. Don't heat it. Let that frost cloth do its work, and then remove it simply after. Bed sheets work great. We actually have a full video on the Mr. Maple Show YouTube channel of Tim and I applying a bed sheet, how we do it in the early spring, if we have time, being nurserymen. So if we have time, we kind of showed what we do when we're protecting. We actually go out and protect the jade dragon in my parents' garden from a late frost that's about to occur. And that'll give you a better idea of what we do. But a little bit of prevention, but don't overdo it. That's really the number one thing there.
Now, this time of the season, right now, for us here in Western North Carolina, as this video is airing, is an excellent time for us to fertilize a lot of our containers out in the nursery setting.
We always let people know where we're at because we have viewers in Australia, we have viewers all over, and you might be in an opposite season. We're typically leafing out that second week to third week in March, so we fertilize in mid to late February going into March as typically our time frame.
And our fertilizer takes it's a slow release fertilizer, and it takes about 30 days to start.
Mm-hmm.
And so as our trees are leafing out, the fertilizer will be hitting right at the peak, right as it's beginning to leaf out. And that's the thing to consider is check with your fertilizer that you're using and read the instructions and try to figure out how quickly does this begin to release. Some things like a liquid Miracle Grow, we wouldn't put out until the plant actually has leaves on it.
Mm-hmm.
When those buds are breaking, that's the time to fertilize for liquids and things that are
the liquid fertilizers
release.
are a little quicker release, like he's saying. So that nitrogen is going to come in much faster than a granulated. I think too much is made with fertilizer about the brand. So people often ask, like, specifically what brand should I use? Now, we use a commercial mix that's made here, by a large brand, and we basically formulate it for exactly what we're looking for. And we go a 15 or lower on the nitrogen. That's really one of the main keys. It's not using too much nitrogen. I would say, and it could be controversial too, that a lot of your commercial brands marketed toward Japanese maples are so low in nitrogen that they're not really providing a benefit. So if your nitrogen, there's an equation there. It's like 10, 10, 10, right? You see those three numbers, and that first number is your nitrogen. If that's like a 4 or 5, I don't know that you're really getting a net benefit for your cost.
I think they might be better for something like a bonsai where you're not wanting it to grow much to begin with, but you want to give it something. Right. I mean, but for a Japanese maple in the landscape, most Japanese maples in containers that you're wanting to grow,
mm-hmm.
I mean, they just don't give enough nutrients in there. And what often happens is they reduce the amount of stuff you're getting.
Right.
And then they raise the price because they put the name Japanese maple on it.
Right.
And so it's often better just to go ahead and get enough fertilizer to actually make the Japanese maple grow. Right. And this is a controversial topic. I mean, the guy who wrote the book on Japanese maples, he said, you don't need to fertilize. And he just knew that the issues that people have with fertilizing is they over-fertilize
mm-hmm.
and they fertilize in the wrong times of the season. And if you fertilize in the spring and you go with a 15 or under, your Japanese maples are going to be great. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. People make mistakes here at this fertilizer so often that it was easier for Veritu's probably just to say,
don't do it
hey,
at all,
just don't do it at all.
He's like, hey, don't do that at all. Just be conscious there. We cut off all fertilizing at our nursery for granulated mixes in May. And that shocks a lot of people. A lot of people are like, wow, really? And you don't want to be, keeping the trees too active going into the wrong time of the year. And a lot of times our mixes say 180-day release for a granulated mix. So you can look at your different fertilizers. Some are heat activated, some are moisture activated. A lot of our commercial ones are heat activated, so they're going to be pushing more growth, in that springtime and in that summer. We actually like to get a lot of our fertilizers out in, mid-February, so they're starting to activate when the tree's waking up itself. So you're actually getting a little bit of a spring push there. And so that's how we like to do it. But be cautious of that. You could over-fertilize too early in the spring and cause your tree to leaf out too quickly. So you definitely want to be cautious of that you're not forcing them to break dormancy early with your fertilizers. Tim mentioned it, but leave the liquid fertilizers alone until later in the season when you're in leaf. The granulated ones don't matter as much on the specific brand as long as you're going in moderation. Now, you got to think about what you're trying to accomplish here too. So we'll have people with a Japanese maple in a container and they say, I've put this Crimson Queen in this pot. I never want to take it out of this pot. What should I fertilize it with? Well, you should probably be going very, very light with your fertilizer. I mean, it's not bad to add some nutrients to the container, but you do want to be using some of those lighter mixes if your goal is not to be growing your tree outside the side of your pot.
And that may be what J.D. Veritu's was hinting at, because we've been to his house. Right. He didn't have a large space to grow Japanese maples, but he had Japanese maples in every space that could be grown, and they were cutting back the widths of many of those Japanese maples years past now. I mean, from when J.D. Veritu's planted them till now, they've been cutting back a lot of those plants, trying to keep them in their spaces. And if he would have been fertilizing very heavily, there's no chance those would have fit in those spaces. So you always have to keep that in mind. What size do you want this plant to get? Should I really be fertilizing it a ton out in the landscape? Naturally, in the landscape, we've got a lot of good nutrients in the soil already.
Right.
I mean, plants grow in the ground if you just put them in the ground. God put a lot of great things in the soil already.
Right.
And so you don't always have to fertilize, but fertilize does make the plant grow faster. And if that's your goal, is to make this plant grow faster, fertilizer is what you're going to use. And this is the time of the season to do it.
Yeah. So early spring, fertilize. That's one of the best times to do that. Now, one thing I always like to talk about is trimming trees in the spring and its relationship really with fertilizing. I often quote Buddy Lee, who's a good friend of mine, and he said, you only want to prune your trees, during the season where you want new growth. So think about pruning as like the fertilizer. So you don't want to be pruning your trees at the wrong time of the year. Now, typically we recommend trimming, shaping, pruning, all three actually very different things in the garden, but we only recommend doing those things before your trees leaf out. So in that typically late February to mid-March frame is when we'll do any pruning here. The later I can get into March, the better, because I'm actually going to promote more new growth. I'm going to put more energy into the root system, and I'm going to get that energy back in growth. So trimming your Japanese maples in spring will actually make them grow much faster. So it is a way to promote growth, but also any major changes need to be done right before the trees leaf out because they're at their peak healing time. So a lot of people will say prune your trees in winter, prune your trees in fall, and I disagree vehemently with this. I think you're opening your trees up for disease. I think you're opening your trees up for bacteria and insects, especially doing it at the beginning of winter. By doing it in, so if we're leafing out, I would prune my tree like March 5th if we're going to leaf out like March 15th or 20th. And I think that's like the perfect time frame because when you do that, the tree is at its highest rejuvenative stage. And yes, you will get some sap. People go, oh no, it's going to bleed. But you will get some sap coming out of the tree. But it heals so much faster during that time frame. And it's not hurting the plant at all. I mean, I've done it to massive plants. And if you do it during that time frame, you can take out more, you can make more adjustments, and you're going to put the energy into the parts of the tree you like.
Yeah, and I've got to start out here by saying, if you're pruning, trimming, and shaping your tree, make sure you've got clean utensils. I mean, we use saws for large material. We use pruners, and we use concave pass-through pruners for some mid-sized stuff, and concave pruners for the smaller stuff.
You'll never be sadder than when you use your $100 pro-grade Joshua Ross to prune too big of a branch and it warps them.
That's so true. But when you're doing this, you're often going around the yard, and what you're often pruning out is dead stuff on your plants. You don't want to pass that along to other plants in your garden. So always make sure that your saws, your chainsaw, everything that you've got, all your materials you use in the garden are cleaned. And this can be done with a 10% bleach solution or rubbing alcohol. I like carrying some rubbing alcohol around, a small towel, and cleaning off my trimmers or my tools in between going to different plants. And this just makes sure that I'm not spreading something around the garden. It's something that sounds simple, but we've all made this mistake. If you just get out there and you just start pruning because, oh man, I've got a great day to go out there and prune, make sure you've got something to clean your pruners because you could be doing more detriment than good. I've seen before at some garden centers where someone had a plant that was infected and they were going around pruning for shape, and they pruned and spread the thing that was wrong with one plant to all the plants in the garden center. So keep that in mind. It's something that's very important, is making sure that you're very clean when you're doing this. But also don't be afraid when you're going out there and pruning. You can take up to 50%, well, really about 55% of that plant out
Right.
in one trimming. And that sounds crazy, and it is, but it can be done. Check out our video. We've got a full video on YouTube on how to prune a Japanese maple, and we go through these step-by-step processes. But the biggest thing I would say is don't be afraid. I mean, we often have people that will go out and make 3 little cuts on their tree and said, I pruned my Japanese maple, and you're like, no. Go back out there and prune some more.
There are really 3 types of people when it comes to pruning Japanese maples. There's the, I pruned my tree correctly. There's the, I'm scared to death to prune my tree. I'm never doing it. I will not prune it no matter what. This thing was expensive. I'm worried about it. It's my baby. And then there's the, I prune every day of the year. I chop everything off. I adjust every single leaf on my tree. And I encourage you to become one of the people that do it in moderation, but at the right times of the year. I think that is the key here. I think timing for pruning is the most important thing about pruning. Obviously, cleanliness is important too, but timing is critical. If you're going to prune at the right time of the year, man, you get some great growth. You can increase kind of the vascular system of your plant. You've kind of worked your plant out. Like it's taking up energy more efficiently. You're going to get some really nice new growth. Now, Japanese maples aren't a cutback shrub. You don't want to be cutting these things down to the ground. But by lightly and uniformly pruning out twiggier growth, you can really increase the health of your plant. I think a plant man and his Bihoo, and he has one of the best Bihoos I've ever seen. He bought the Bihoo from us, smaller plant, and he trims it pretty regularly. And by doing so, it's just an amazing plant. I mean, that new growth he's getting on that tree is spectacular, and it's really a lot to do with timing.
It really is. Now, the one tool I would say you don't want to use on a Japanese maple for pruning is a hedge trimmer. We call this a maple massacre, and that just makes a poodle out of a Japanese maple, and it deforms the shape and makes it look horrible. So please don't do this. People often talk about crepe murders. The maple massacres are just as bad. They're probably worse.
Oh, they're worse.
And so keep that in mind. Don't be using a hedge pruner. If you see someone using a hedge pruner, just walk up to them and say, don't.
Hey,
please don't.
We say gardening is for your own fun, but if you do prune your Japanese maple with a hedge pruner, I will judge you for it. So this is also an ideal time to transplant. That's right before the tree leaves out. So we've kind of backed up slightly here. We're talking about that early time frame right before your tree's gonna be in leaf, and from that, I would almost say mid to late February to March for us here in Western North Carolina. Again, we're 6B, so it's gonna adjust a little bit considering where you're at. But right now is an ideal time for us to transplant trees before they've leafed out. They're at their highest rejuvenative stage. That's why we prune during that time, and it's why we transplant. The trees are at their most forgiving stage during this point. So you can transplant one. You can remove some of the root ball. You don't want to be, you still want to be doing these things in moderation, but you can. You don't need to worry as much about transpiration like you would in leaf. So this is the ideal time. If we're a gardener and we're like, I planted that tree there and I'm not loving it, this is the time frame to move it.
And you're going to be damaging some of the roots whenever you're pruning. You're going to be cutting off some of the roots. So the reason this is such a great time to transplant, like Matt talked about, is it doesn't have leaves on it. The leaves are not going to lose moisture when you transplant. If you're transplanting a Japanese maple when it's in leaf, that's often the reason why the plant just goes into shock and can often die from transplant shock. If you're transplanting when a plant doesn't have leaves on it, especially a Japanese maple, you can transplant that plant. But remember, we just also talked about this is the time for fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And when you're transplanting a Japanese maple, it's an excellent idea to fertilize it with vitamin B or kelp. And that helps promote root growth, those white roots. And you're going to be damaging those when you're transplanting a Japanese maple. And by giving them that kelp or vitamin B fertilizer, because this is the time of the season you can fertilize,
right?
You can promote some of those white rooting. And again, if the plant has already started to break bud, the leaves on the buds have already opened up, you may be getting a little too late to transplant. Mm-hmm. But if they haven't gotten to that stage, you can still transplant.
Now, this is also the easiest time of the year to go and upsize your pot or change out your pot or root prune the tree in your pot to keep it in the container longer. But there's a difference between transplanting and moving trees around in containers. One of the reasons we love being a container nursery here is you can plant almost any time of the year from container to ground. By transplanting, we mean digging a tree up out of your yard and moving it to a different spot in your yard, because you're going to disturb the most roots when you're moving a tree from ground to ground. Big in-ground nurseries will not dig their trees once they're in leaf. So once the trees leaf out, it's too late. They're only going to cause more damage and shock to those Japanese maples. So once your tree's in leaf, be advised that transpiration rate is going to be far higher, and you're going to cause more damage and have more risk. Can it be done? Certainly can be done, but your risk rate is going to be much higher. And by doing it in that late February to early March before you leaf out, you're taking a lot of the risk out of it. You're giving yourself every chance for that tree to, transplant in the new location and look great.
Yeah, and you're definitely right, Matt. There's a big difference between transplanting and planting. If you're just planting a Japanese maple in a container, you can do that year-round as long as the ground's not frozen. Now, some of our friends in Zone 5, this is the absolute best time to plant mini plants in your garden because they can get established before the cold winter coming on the following winter. And that's something to keep in mind, is that if you're in those Zone 5s, this is the absolute best time. You can plant year-round as long as the ground's not frozen, but if you plant now, the plant's going to get its roots out and get established before those cold things that happen, the cold weather that comes in this winter.
So, guys, we went through several things here on the checklist so far for spring. One of the main things you're going to be doing in spring is increasing your water amount. Water is pivotal. We did a whole podcast on how to water your Japanese maple. We've talked about water extensively here on our channel because water is one of the biggest things that can go right and go wrong with your Japanese maple. Oftentimes, too much water and too little water can look very similar. But in spring, your tree's leafing out. It's been dormant. The sap is now higher in that plant. It's drawing energy up. It's pushing out new growth, and it's going to need more water than it was getting in those winter months. So you're going to need to increase the water amount and be conscious of that going into spring. If it's in an area where it's not getting natural water, you're really going to have to pay close attention to your tree. If it's on a patio or a deck, this is often a time when people can kill their plant by underwatering it when it needs water in the spring.
So fertilizer and water go hand in hand. I mean, if you have a tree that you've got out there that it's springtime and you fertilize it and you're not watering it, that can cause some detrimental effects to that plant. I mean, you got to make sure that if you've put a granulated fertilizer or something out there, that you are giving that plant more water, because fertilizer without water can actually act almost like a weed killer, especially if you put too much fertilizer. I mean, too much fertilizer can always act as a weed killer, but with the right amount of fertilizer and not water, you can actually burn some plants, especially some Japanese maples on the tender new growth. So it's always important to make sure that you're watering enough in the springtime, especially because they need more water because they're growing. Right. Any plant that's growing is going to need more water, but especially if it's has fertilizer on it. Because if it has fertilizer on it, you've got salts and all these things that can dry out a plant. Add that water. They're definitely need more water if they've been fertilized.
Now, I know we're beating a dead horse. Maybe we're beating a dead maple for you, but drainage is paramount during this time. So, you want to be looking for any changes to your water flow. You want to be looking like it'll surprise you. Sometimes a neighbor may have adjusted their land, and now you're getting more water, flow to a specific area in your landscape. And so an area that wasn't soggy may be more soggy this spring. And so springtime's a really important time to kind of take account of the drainage and make sure that your Japanese maples have good drainage. And if they're staying wet, you need to move them. I mean, it's one of those times either you're going to have to move in leaf or whenever possible if they're staying too wet, because too wet is the easiest way to kill a Japanese maple. You've heard us beat that dead horse before, but drainage is very important. Also make sure your containers don't have the saucer of death below them, and make sure your containers have good drainage during this time frame. You're going to notice more in the spring. I mean, I bring this up again for spring because you're going to be watering more. If water's standing and it's staying there more than, an adequate amount of time for the drainage to be draining through, you're going to need to make some changes.
Yeah, that saucer of death, that's one of the most important things to avoid. I mean, if you want a healthy Japanese maple growing in your landscape and garden, if you want a healthy Japanese maple growing in a container, you want good drainage. And those saucers of death, those plates that go underneath the containers make that the bottom roots get very soggy and they stay very wet, and they can cause a lot of future issues. And here at Mr. Maple, we want your plants to be healthy and to thrive, and for you to really enjoy the beauty of these Japanese maples. I mean, I know some nurseries take the aspect of, well, if they die, they're just going to buy another one. No, we want your trees from us to thrive and do well. We've put a lot of hard work and energy.
These are our babies. We want them to thrive.
Exactly. We put a lot of work into these, and we want them to look beautiful in your garden as well. So we always give you the best tips we can. And that saucer of death is something that happens so frequently, we can't not harp on that every time we talk about it.
So make sure your trees are drying out adequately between watering. You are going to have to water more during the spring, so it's going to have to be something you check on. But it's, trees that are established in the landscape don't require a lot. I mean, we don't water our garden here at all in Western North Carolina. I mean, we let it naturally receive water unless we're in a drought. So, be conscious of those things, but definitely be taking account of the water situation. Has there been any changes from the previous years? Are you seeing any new conditions where your garden is staying damper than it was before or drier? And then make changes during that springtime, because it's an easy time to fix the course before things go wrong.
So we've covered fertilizer, we've covered water, we've talked about pruning, shaping, trimming, transplanting, planting, cold snaps, and frost. I mean,
there's a big checklist in the spring. The spring is when a lot of things happen.
This is one of the biggest times for growing Japanese maples, different things to do. Now, in the springtime, insects, they come back out. I mean, these insects have been gone all winter long, and then all of a sudden they start appearing again. And one of the first ones we start seeing are those aphids. And one of the things I would say, first off, don't overreact. I mean, typically aphids on a small scale aren't going to cause a tree in the landscape a big issue.
Right.
But when you start seeing large colonies of aphids, they do need to be treated. And there's some simple things you can do. And an insecticidal soap or some soapy water is fantastic. You just want to make sure you avoid antibacterial soap if you're making your own. The insecticidal soap is typically fairly safe on the Japanese maples, and you don't have any extra issues that you have with that. Watch out over treating your Japanese maple with harsh chemicals in the early spring when that foliage is extremely tender.
Even things that normally would work for Japanese maples may affect that tender spring foliage differently.
And that's why the insecticidal soap or soapy water, just make sure you're avoiding the antibacterial soap. That soapy water will actually kill the aphids. The insecticidal soap is fantastic at killing the aphids in this early springtime. Often when trees are just beginning to bud out and you're starting to see that fresh new growth, the aphids will actually go, and what they do is they come up on the new soft, fresh new growth, and they start sucking sap from it. And this will reduce the overall growth of your plant. But if there's a large population of it, they will start to take out a lot of the sap and moisture from that tree. So those plants are going to need more water if they've got aphids on them. But also, we're going to need to make sure that we treat for them if they become an overburden on your Japanese maple.
It's so important not to overdo it at this stage. I've seen people treat for things that you can only do out of leaf, like some of your heavy insecticides, like Merit or even some of the systemics you can use might not work as well on fresh new growth and foliage. So you just have to be a little bit more careful. Phyton 77 might work out of leaf, but that might not be the chemical you want to be introducing on your spring foliage. Everything you do has a trade-off. So you have to look at the cost benefit of every single thing you do with a living organism, and keep in mind that your plant's a living organism. So you have to do a cost analysis benefit for, is it better to treat for the aphids, or is it a small enough population that I really don't need to?
And I think the biggest thing is just not to overreact. I mean, it's often what we do when we see the aphids that causes the damage to the plant that's a long-term damage or can kill the plant.
Right.
I've seen plenty of people go and they get trazicide by spectricide, which may be a fantastic chemical
Right.
when the plant, that's leaf is more mature and is hardened off, but that fresh new growth may be damaged by it. You may get mutated growth because of it if you're treating it during this early spring leaf out rather than once that leaf has established itself. So just keep in mind the safest chemicals like the insecticidal soap, that's really what you want to be using in the springtime garden. You want to avoid some of these harsher chemicals that may cause damage to the tender growth of a Japanese maple.
So ladybugs are awesome. Also, the native praying mantis are awesome. They'll eat a lot of aphids. Ladybugs tend to tear into aphid populations pretty well. So that's a great remedy. I know some stores even. I remember buying bags of ladybugs for my grandma that she would let go in her garden to get rid of some of the aphids. Ladybugs are great for that though. So there are some natural remedies there, but don't overdo it. You don't want to overdo anything, and just be conscious of what's going on. And if you have a normal amount of aphid damage, take some further steps to correct. But it's one of those things that you see a little bit in the early spring. It's one of the only few insects you really see in early spring. Leaf hoppers normally late into the summer, early summer, late spring.
Yeah, and insects, they're not a huge deal in the spring, but this is when they start to reappear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you may have ants that form in your containers. Again, same logic applies. Use the bare minimum chemicals that you can treat these insects with that doesn't hurt your Japanese maples.
So we've been going down the spring checklist here. We've covered a lot of topics here that are specific to spring. One we like to point out for grafted Japanese maples specifically is in spring is typically the time when you can identify any growth coming out from below the graft. Now, on more mature trees, you typically don't get this. In fact, if you take off any lower growth for the first few years, you typically get very few shoots coming out from below the graft. But this is a great time. A lot of times we're going to be using green understock. And if you have a red tree and you see some green down there, it's going to be easy to identify in that early spring. That's the time to go ahead and remove that. If you're seeing bright chartreuse growth below the graft, it could even be a grafted to a red, so be conscious of that. But most of what's typically used in the nursery trade is a green. It's easy to identify. It's easy to see. And oftentimes, it's just a small shoot at this point. You can just brush it off with your hand even.
And if we get a spring frost or we get an environmental factor that stresses the Japanese maple a little bit, you may get some rootstock that tries to pop up. And the springtime is one of the times when a Japanese maple grows, and hence this can be one of the time that you may see branches coming from below the graft. And so identify where that graft is and look, any growth that's coming from below that graft, make sure that's removed. This is the perfect time of the season. We only have 2 times of the season where a Japanese maple puts on growth typically. Some places may get 3, maybe Texas and some hotter zones, but typically for us, we only get 2 growth periods, once in the spring and then once again during the summer. And during these 2 times, check for rootstock. Rootstock, I mean, if you let that rootstock grow up, people will say, oh, I've got a bicolor tree.
I love it. Oh, it looks like 2 trees in one. Well, eventually, typically what happens is that rootstock becomes more dominant and takes over, and you have less and less of what you bought the tree for. So that lace leaf slowly disappearing while that larger tree is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in few instances, it can be nice. Like I've seen a few that were actually fairly nice and enjoyable, but for the most part, it ruins the tree.
Yeah, and it really does. It ruins what you selected that Japanese maple for. That rootstock is a more basic green Japanese maple. And while it may be a beautiful Japanese maple, it may no longer be dwarf. It may no longer have the same fall color or the characteristics that you looked for with that original plant that you'd selected. So keep that in mind. But this is also the time that you check for reversions. And so for selections like Rainbow, selections like Atama Nishiki or Hinoda Nishiki or Kagero,
Fujinami Nishiki.
We
just made everybody's heart drop right there.
even some plants that are a little more stable, like Lillian's Jewel and Geisha Gone Wild.
Butterfly.
Yeah, butterfly. Beni Shishihinga. This is the time of the season to look for your reversions because you only have 2 times of the season that this plant puts on growth. And right now, in the early spring, as soon as it leaves out, you see the solid green foliage. You see the solid red foliage with no variegation. This is the time to go in and prune out those branches soon as you see them.
Right. So this is one of the few pruning things we do encourage once in leaf in early spring. You're going to go ahead and remove the branches so they're not stealing more energy away. Unfortunately, with something like Rainbow or Fujinami Nishiki, you're going to need to prune these more for color than for shape. So you're going to have to be at the mercy of changing it so that it stays, variegated. Not so much with butterfly. With butterfly and things like that, they're less likely to revert, but they still can happen. So oftentimes, even in early spring on butterfly or Beni Shishihinga, the reverted parts will leaf out first. So you'll be very obvious. You'll see all this green with not what you wanted, and you can go ahead and remove that. And you're going to be taking that, that energy stealer away from the variegated part so that your tree is going to look more consistent and better overall.
Now, some plants I should mention right now that don't revert. We've got Oridano Nishiki. Now, I say they don't revert. Sometimes they might sow solid green branches, but those branches aren't reverted. They still have the genetic material to be variegated on those branches. Higashiyama styles. So
Ghost series types.
Yeah, Ghost series types. Those styles don't revert. So in the springtime, if you have green foliage, don't worry about it. Maybe you got a little too much fertilizer on your Higashiyama. It may lift out a little too quickly. Don't try pruning those branches out in the early spring. The same to be said with Kotonoito types and other types. If you see something during the spring, tag it and then continue to watch it to figure out is that truly a reversion. Next year, does that go to a smaller leaf? Before you prune it out. Sometimes in the early spring, if you have some unusual growth, it could be attributed to just fertilizing a little bit and getting a lot of good growth. But on those Oridano Nishiki styles, I've talked about this time and time again. Before it leaves out, that's really the best time to do some pruning on Oridano Nishiki, Asahi Zuru, Cotton Candy, Kotobuki, Ilarian.
You're going to get your best variegation.
Yeah, go back, give those plants a pretty heavy pruning, and when it leaves out in the springtime, you've given it a slight stress, and you're going to have tons of variegation all across that plant.
And people ask about how to do that all the time, and the honest answer is it's not too different than pruning a regular upright Japanese maple. You're going to want to take out any of the twiggy stuff. You're going to want to take out any of the stuff that's kind of just robbing the plant of energy or conflicting branches. And if you're doing that, you're going to push new growth. So by taking out the twiggier stuff, by taking out the conflicting branches and leaving a central leader, you can actually cut back some of last year's new growth a little bit if you want to. you're going to flush that tree back out into some amazing colors. And that's going to be the most colorful you've ever seen a Reed Nonishki.
I think some of the funniest things is when people have a tree and the worst thing happens, and they had a Reed Nonishki style that was solid green or something, and a tree falls down on it. And then all of a sudden, what comes back out is just crazy variegation. Right. And they're like, wow, this tree's more beautiful than it's ever been. And sometimes they're almost happy that this tree got pruned naturally to have that variegation. But you can prune back a lot of the Reed Nonishki style. That's that white and sometimes pink swirling, and just create a masterpiece that are simply amazing.
So if you're new to maples, familiarize yourself a little bit with that style. We call a lot of things in that kind of a Reed-No group. Go look at a Reed Nonishki, and you can kind of see that pink and white swirling style variegation. It goes deep into the leaf, has a regular size leaves. Not to be confused with butterfly style variegation or even Benny Shishihinga. You're going to want to remove any green on butterfly. You're going to have your best butterfly if you're taking that out every year in the early spring.
Yeah, so on varieties like butterfly, Benny Shishihinga, if you see those green, and often they may leaf out before the rest of the tree. And that's a quick way to go and spot them really easy and prune those out and then let the rest of the tree come out with that variegation. And this time of the season is perfect. Check for reversions. Before it leaves out, prune back your Reed Nonishki styles, and watch out for your rootstock.
Yeah, so, okay, a few other things. This is the earliest time of the year. The sap is high in your Japanese maple. They're actually at their most flexible stage right after they've leafed out. So to stake your Japanese maples, this is one of the most forgiving and easy times to stake a Japanese maple. So if you're growing, some of those pendulous treasure plants like Dragon Master or Looking Glass Rock or any of those really cool plants like that, Looking Glass Falls, any of those really cool plants like that have more of a pendulous nature to them, like Ryusei and Ryusen, this is one of the very best times to stake those trees. Now, we did a video on how to stake your Japanese maple, but it's very, very simple. And you can stake really any of the weeping forms to be taller. They're actually just going to grow a little bit faster, and any of your weeping forms like Orangiola or Inaba Shidari are going to form a higher canopy and make a larger tree faster if you stake them up. Doesn't bother the tree long term, but what you're going to do is just stake up a central leader. You're just going to pick a piece that's flimsy, and you don't have to bend anything that's breakable. If it's already breakable and it's headed parallel to the ground, leave that branch alone if it's not bendable. Take a small branch that's bendable, aim that up, and stake that up. Even if it's 6 inches, stake that up and let that start to be your new starting point. And you can stake any Japanese maple that's pendulous to be a lot taller.
Now, with upright selections, you can actually stake these as well to give them a straighter appearance if that's what you're going for. I personally don't prefer that. I prefer a Japanese maple that has a more natural shape that is less street tree.
Right.
And is more of your traditional Japanese style.
If you show those to people in Japan, they're like, oh, no, this is terrible.
But if you want a street tree style tree, this is the time you can stake, and you can stake it up. And during the winter months, before this was the time you could prune out those side branches to really get more of that street tree style look on your Japanese maple, if that's what you're going for.
Oftentimes in America, people want that more uniform kind of cookie cutter look to them, and it's easier to create that. Now, I certainly like to create a higher break in gardens I walk under, so I understand that. And that's one of the reasons I'll stake is to create a higher breaking point for me to be able to walk under stuff. But you don't have to stake a plant. It's not something that's necessarily a requirement. But if you're going to be growing, especially some of the extremely pendulous ones, they will be more ground cover like if you're not staking them up. Like Ryusen will be low and very wide if not staked up.
Now, one thing to keep in mind, when staking a Japanese maple, you don't have to stake it straight. I mean, Jim Putnam recently got a Dragon Master from us and created a serpentine with his Dragon Master. And this is the time of the season when they're the most flexible. So this is the time of the season, if you want to make a serpentine out of a Japanese maple, this is the time of the season to do that. One thing to keep in mind, too, is that if your Japanese maple, it's a weeping style, has multiple leaders, you don't have to stake it straight up. I mean, you can literally use multiple stakes on this plant to shape and design however you see fit.
I've seen some amazing work done on lace leaves with just like tons of stakes, and they've kind of controlled every aspect of it.
And that's the thing I love about staking is you can take this and use this as one element of creating and a piece of art in your garden. And that's what we're doing with pruning. That's what we're doing with fertilizing. And that's what we're doing with staking as well. And these are all different aspects that you can do. And this is the time of the season to really work with them, is the spring, to really make this tree what you want it to be. And one thing I always want to reiterate during this time of the season, look at your Japanese maple, read its description, look at photos of your Japanese maple. Like photos on MrMaple.com, we've got lots of photos of mature specimens.
Mm-hmm.
Get an idea of what this tree's natural shape is. It's going to have a natural shape all by itself.
Yeah.
And when you're staking this plant, when you're pruning on this plant, be thinking, hey, let's accentuate that shape.
Right.
Let's not try to make this something that it's not.
You don't need a weeping blood good. You need to find
Exactly.
a form that already is weeping and enjoy it.
Exactly. And we don't want to make all the plants look the same. We don't want cookie cutter plants. Cookie cutter plants are
That's
just
one of
boring.
my biggest pet peeves is like when some nurseries will prune every single tree into the same shape. So it's like, what does a Kamagata look like? It looks like a Kiyohime. What does a Kiyohime look like? It looks like an Inaba-Shidari. Like everything can't be the same shape. I think letting the trees grow on their own some is really what's beautiful about Japanese maples, and the fact that they do look different, not only from cultivar but from individual specimens. I think that's one of the true real beauties of Japanese maples. So don't think that your tree has to look exactly like everyone else's to be enjoyable.
But just remember, staking, this is just one piece that you can use in your arsenal in training and shaping your Japanese maple in the landscape and garden.
Now, if you're doing that too early, so if you're doing it before it leaves out, it may snap. It's going to be more rigid, and it's going to be less flexible during the winter. And the same can be said for late summer. Once that growth's hardened off, it's going to be a lot more rigid, and bending that tree is going to be more likely for you to break a branch or to snap a branch. You'll find that in that early spring, young maples are very easy because they're very bendable. But you'll find even on older trees that they're more susceptible to shaping during the early spring because they're a little bit more bendable. They're a little bit more malleable. You can get in there and play with them. Especially new growth is going to be way easier to bend, when the sap's high.
And if you have a Japanese maple out in your garden right now and you're thinking about staking up this spring, once the tree leaves out, there's some things you can do right now that really benefit that. You can go in and give it a pruning right now. Right now in this time of the season, this late winter, early spring, give it a pruning, give it some fertilizer, and then when that tree leaves out, it's going to push a lot of growth, and that will give you more to work with on your staking. When that tree has that long, flexible growth, you're going to be able to go in and work with a lot more.
Now, shade, sun in the early spring. This is something that I think we should talk about more in the nursery industry, and it's an interesting thing. Japanese maples, when you receive your Japanese maple, especially in early spring, you want to give it a little bit of time to adapt in some shade. So ideally, don't plant it right away in full sun as soon as you get out of the box. You want to get your Japanese maple out and water it in and give it a day or so in the shade to kind of acclimate, and you're not going directly to full sun immediately. But that early spring is a great time to get your Japanese maples adapted to sun conditions. So Japanese maples do their best when they leaf out naturally in the ground and they get some sun tolerance. They kind of build up a little bit more of that. Dad used to call it sunscreen for the plant, but they definitely build up a little bit more tolerance to that sun that's going to benefit that tree later into the season, especially in some of those high heat summer times. And so it's important to not bring your trees inside, get them tender and void of all sunlight, and then bring them back out to a sunny condition too quickly. So you need to be conscious of that, but also allowing that tree to build up some of its natural sun resistance over the spring into the summer will really give it a great deal of benefit versus a tree that's been in too much shade then dropped right into summer sun.
Where we're at here in Western North Carolina, we can't grow a Acer shirasalanum autumn moon or Arium in full sun. Often we have to find a sweet spot. We're moving pots around in the garden trying to find that sweet spot. Now, this is the time of the season to really be trying to find that sweet spot so that plant can get established out there and, like Matt talked about, adapt and really get used to having a slightly more sunlight condition. If you can find that sweet spot where it's happy, it's a tree that's doing well in that spot, it's often going to do well throughout the rest of the season. Now, the summer months, you may have to give it in some of the hot parts of the summer, move that container to a slightly more protected location. But it's going to be more adapted for that higher heat situation if you give it a little more sunlight in this early springtime.
So, guys, we've went through a full litany of things to do in the spring garden. As spring gardeners with Japanese maples, this is one of our busiest seasons. This is definitely our time to shine. I like Japanese maples the most in the early spring. I think it's the most fun time around the nursery. It's the time that gets me excited. It's, with Japanese maples, you get that full level of anticipation. I always say those conifer guys don't have enough patience, right? You get something all year, but with Japanese maples, it's that buildup of spring, that anticipation that really makes it a special time for gardeners. And so I think there's something to be said about that just special early spring time frame.
If we didn't have the winter, we couldn't enjoy the leaves coming out in the early spring with these amazing colors. I mean, it's this ever-changing beauty that Japanese maples have that attracts us so much to Japanese maples. And that spring anticipation, I mean, it's one of the most exciting things. I mean, you just get butterflies running out in the nursery looking at these plants leafing out with all these different colors.
Oh, it's such a fun time. You can't not be optimistic when things are leafing out. It's just such a fun time here at our nursery. It's a time when everybody wants to visit. It's a time when everybody's excited. And just that new growth in that spring is just such a magical season. For me, I think spring beats fall. I love fall with Japanese maples, but spring is more consistent for me, and it's just more magical. You can see every little diversity in every single different cultivar. Since we do over 1,400 different cultivars here at our nursery, you really can understand all the nuances.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things about the springtime, because many times the spring differences in the color are outstanding. Mm-hmm. And you may see orange and yellow and pink and red and green and yellow. I mean, these colors are outrageous. This different styles of variegation. I mean, the springtime, to me, is the peak with Japanese maples. They're great all year round, but the springtime is by far one of my most favorite times to go out and really enjoy Japanese maples in the garden or in the nursery.
Oh, it's a magical time of the year. It's a time I reminisce on my Aunt Marilee coming to visit. One time, she was a really influential aunt of ours who passed away about 10 years ago of cancer. And I remember, her showing up in the spring just out of nowhere to see the new grafts and all the new things starting to leaf out. And you're like, how, she drove from her cancer treatments on the other side of the state to come see the spring foliage. And it's a time I like to reminisce about that. And it's just one of those things that just feels special. There's something about spring that's just kind of magical. And I love it. So as an example of that, I would say last on our gardening checklist is you got to get your cameras ready. Spring is one of the most fun times to take photos of your Japanese maples.
Make sure you've got enough batteries, because they're going to go dead. You're going to spend hours out there taking photographs. Make sure that you've got your cameras cleaned. I mean, this is one of the pinnacle times to go out there and photograph Japanese maples when they are just putting on outstanding colors that are the most dynamic and have the most contrast of any part of the season.
As plant collectors, we like to study all the little nuances. And this is the time of the year when the flowers are out. This is the time of the year where the flowers are very prominent on your Acer japonicums. This is the time of the year when you might see, subtle changes in color to even an Osakazuki. To a lot of people, it's just a green, right? Like, oh, it's a green tree. But your collectors notice those pigment changes and all those little different changes going on in the flower and the leaf. And it's just one of the most special times. One of my favorite tips for telling people about photography in the early spring is I like to photograph my garden or even the nursery after a little shower. So after one of those spring showers, when the plants are just slightly damp, that's when I think they capture the photography like the best. Like that's when my pictures look just amazing.
And you don't have to have a macro lens to do this. Although macro lens, you can get some really crazy photos in the springtime as well. Your cell phones, they can often take some amazing photos. Make sure this spring to share your photos of your Japanese maples in the MrMaple Friends group on Facebook.
Yeah.
We've got a great group of people who love Japanese maples, love sharing everything they love about Japanese maples.
If you shared your plant pics on Facebook and they were underappreciated, we've got a place for you.
Exactly. Bring them to the MrMaple Friends group on Facebook. Post them in there. People will love them. And we love them. So I know all of our customers will as well. Every spring, our Facebook page is just a litany of photos of people just enjoying their spring garden.
Guys, I hope you love spring and Japanese maples. We went through, the spring gardening checklist for Japanese maples today. I hope you've enjoyed that, and it's given you some steps to think about this spring. Some steps that you might be planning to do, and it gives you the better time frame for when to do them. A lot of people are already planning on pruning. A lot of people are already planning on fertilizing. So we hope this has shown you the right time frame and given you better parameters for when and how to do these things. Spring is my favorite time of the year. If you can't tell, spring is our time here at the nursery. My friends give up on hanging out with me until about June because we're so busy here at the nursery. But spring is our busy season, and it's just one of those magical times, especially for Japanese maple growers and collectors. It's one of those times where I think there's always just a sense of optimism.
And if you enjoyed this spring checklist, make sure that you're following us on your favorite podcast platform. Make sure that you follow us on YouTube because we're going to be constantly putting out more and more content this spring.
We're going to some crazy gardens this spring.
On Japanese maples. And on top of that, make sure you're shopping with us on MrMaple.com. We work very hard to put out all this great content for you, and we'd really appreciate your support by shopping with us on MrMaple.com.
Yeah. Guys, one of my favorite things we do, if you're not familiar with our YouTube channel, are walk-through Wednesdays. And we're going to some awesome gardens. So if you like spring foliage, get ready because we're going to go to some top-notch Japanese maple collections and arboretums, and we're going to film them in peak spring color. So I hope you're excited about that because I know I'm excited. We've got Corbin here. We've got more film people, so we're even adding to our staff for our film crew here so we can get more content out to you guys. And so I appreciate you being part of that, guys. We like providing a weekly Japanese maple show here on the Mr. Maple podcast. And hey, we just appreciate you tuning in. It means a lot to us.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.